All right, so we're diving into a listener question today, and it's a big one. We're talking about the fall of Hindu kingdoms, particularly those conquered by, well, armies from Central Asia and the Middle East. A lot of our listeners are fascinated by this period, but everyone seems a little lost when it comes to the why behind it all.
It's a complex period, absolutely, with a lot of factors at play. And it's easy to get bogged down in the details, the names, the dates.
Right, like it's easy to get lost in the weeds.
Exactly. So I think the best place for us to start is with, well, setting the stage. Because when we talk about India during this time, we're not talking about a unified empire like what you might see, say, with the Romans.
Okay, so already a different picture than what a lot of us might be picturing.
Yeah, so instead of this big unified empire, think of it more as like a very fragmented landscape. Lots of smaller kingdoms, each with its own ruler or its own ambitions.
Kind of like a, what do you call those? A mosaic.
Yeah, a mosaic. That's a great way to put it. But here's the thing about this mosaic. These kingdoms were often more at odds with each other than they were united against outside forces.
Ah, so internal conflicts playing a big part here. Didn't the sources mention something about Rajputs? I've always been a little fascinated by them.
Oh, the Rajputs are key here. They were known for their warrior culture, their military prowess. But unfortunately, a lot of that energy was directed inwards. They were constantly vying for power amongst themselves.
So even with all that strength, they were spread thin, too busy looking over their shoulders at each other to see the bigger threat.
Exactly. Think of it like, well, imagine the drama of Game of Thrones, but with real-world consequences.
Okay, yeah, that paints a pretty vivid picture. So I'm starting to see how this internal division played a role, but it can't just be as simple as they weren't unified, so they were conquered, right? There had to be more to it than that.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to unpack. It wasn't just about who had more soldiers. We've got to factor in the strategies, the technology, the whole shebang.
And that's what we're here for, to get into all those fascinating details that help make sense of history.
Yeah.
The shebang. All right, so it wasn't just about internal struggles. What else were these invaders bringing to the table that gave them an edge?
Well, let's talk about game changers, because these invaders, especially those from Central Asia, they weren't just bringing more soldiers, they were bringing a whole different style of fighting.
The sources mentioned cavalry, like a lot about cavalry. Was it really that big of a deal?
Oh, it was massive. Think about the armies these Hindu kingdoms were used to fighting. Mostly infantry, right? Maybe
Yeah.
some chariots, elephants.
Yeah, the sources mentioned war elephants. I have to admit, I always thought those would be pretty unstoppable.
Oh, they were intimidating for sure, and could be effective in the right circumstances. But against a disciplined cavalry force, they had their disadvantages.
Okay, so not as invincible as they sound.
Not quite. Plus, horses were just faster, more agile. They could cover ground quickly, outmaneuver opponents, and strike with those deadly horse archers. Imagine facing wave after wave of arrows raining down on you. Talk about demoralizing.
Yeah, I can see how that would change the game. It's almost like a completely different sport. And speaking of game changers, the sources also mentioned something that completely revolutionized warfare around this time. Gunpowder.
Ah, yes. Gunpowder. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Because when you introduce cannons and muskets, well, it's not just a shift in tactics. It's a whole new era of warfare.
And the Hindu kingdoms, were they like early adopters of this new technology?
Not really, no. They were definitely slow to adapt, and that hesitation, well, that cost them. Because the invaders, particularly the Mughals later on, they saw the potential of gunpowder and they ran with it. They used cannons to blast down city walls that had stood for centuries. They used muskets to gain an advantage in close combat. It was a game changer in every sense of the word.
It's incredible how something like gunpowder can have such a ripple effect across history. But it wasn't just about the weapons themselves, right? The sources also mentioned something called siege warfare and how effective the invaders were at it.
Siege warfare, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely crucial. You see, a lot of Indian cities and fortresses at that time were designed to withstand traditional attacks. But the invaders, they brought in these incredibly sophisticated siege tactics. Tunneling, for example, digging under those massive walls, or building ramps to bring battering rams and towers right up to the fortifications.
So it's almost like those heist movies where meticulous planning and the element of surprise are key to cracking a seemingly impenetrable vault. Except in this case, the vault is an entire city.
Exactly. It was like a chess match, figuring out the weak points and exploiting them.
Right.
And the invaders were really, really good at it. And let's not forget, these invasions, they weren't just driven by military ambition. There was a huge economic factor at play too.
Oh, right. The sources were pretty clear that India's wealth was a big draw for these
It
invaders.
was a huge EE draw. You have to remember, many of these invaders came from harsher, less prosperous lands. They had heard tales of India's legendary wealth, its spices, its silks, its gold. It was like a beacon drawing them in.
And those magnificent temples overflowing with riches, I imagine those must have seemed like irresistible targets.
Yeah, the sources didn't shy away from that at all. It sounds like those temples weren't just seen as religious sites, but also as, well, treasure troves. Sadly, that's an accurate way to put it. And I think it's important to remember, a lot of these invaders, they weren't Hindu. They came from different faiths with different views on, well, the sanctity of these temples and the wealth they held.
So looting them wouldn't have carried the same, I don't know, taboo as it might for a Hindu ruler?
Exactly. For someone like, say, Mahmud of Ghazni, who led multiple raids into India, these temples were, well, they were legitimate targets. They were seen as symbols of wealth and power, ripe for the taking.
And I imagine the psychological impact on the local population, seeing their sacred spaces desecrated like that, it must have been devastating.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about the material losses, which were significant, but also the spiritual and psychological impact. Imagine seeing your temples, your places of worship, ransacked and plundered. It would shake the very core of your faith and your sense of security.
It adds this whole other dimension to the conquest, doesn't it? It's one thing to be defeated militarily, but to have your cultural and religious identity targeted like that cuts deep.
It absolutely does. And it's something that echoes through history, shaping perceptions and influencing relations for centuries to come. And, when we look at all of this, the political fragmentation, the military advantages, the economic incentives, and even these cultural and religious clashes, it paints a very nuanced picture of why these Hindu kingdoms were so vulnerable.
Yeah, it's definitely more complex than just saying, well, one side was stronger, so they won.
Right. It was a perfect storm of factors all coming together at a pivotal moment in history.
So if we're trying to answer that big why question from our listeners, it's not about pointing to a single cause, but rather understanding this web of interconnected factors.
Exactly. It's about understanding the context, the choices made, the missed opportunities, and how they all contributed to shaping the trajectory of this period. And I think maybe even more importantly, it's about recognizing that history isn't inevitable. It's a series of choices, and those choices have consequences.
It really makes you think about what might have been different, right? Like if those Hindu kingdoms had been more unified, if they had adopted gunpowder technology sooner, if they'd formed stronger alliances, could history have unfolded differently?
It's one of those great what-ifs of history, isn't it? And while we can't go back in time and change the course of events, we can learn from them. We can examine these pivotal moments and ask ourselves, what can we learn from this? How can understanding the past help us navigate the complexities of the present? And maybe, just maybe, by engaging with history in this way, we can make better choices, both individually and collectively.
Choices that lead to a less fragmented, more unified future. It's a lot to ponder, that's for sure. But hey, that's what these deep dives are all about, taking those big questions, those seemingly overwhelming historical events, and breaking them down piece by piece until we start to see the patterns, the connections, the humanity at the heart of it all. So to our listeners, keep those questions coming, and we'll keep diving into the depths of history together.